Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. Over $1 billion, that's the value of the latest round of support Ukraine secured from its Western partners. It comes as President Zelenskyy held conversations with both U.S. President Donald Trump and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. More on that in just a moment, but before we dive in, the latest headlines. The price of Russian gasoline reaches record-level highs. The European Commission defends the shape of its trade deal with the U.S. And the president of Israel looks to drum up support in the Baltic states. The Netherlands, Denmark, Norway and Sweden have announced $1 billion worth of fresh support for Ukraine as part of the new scheme agreed with U.S. President Donald Trump. The new surge in support comes as the U.S. leader spoke to Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, who said the two coordinated their positions. Our correspondent Alex Cadier is in Kyiv for us. Good evening, Alex. So let's start by talking about that support package, shall we? How much of a difference does it make?
Well, good evening, Claudia. The hope for residents here in Kyiv, for residents in cities and towns across Ukraine, is that it will make a big difference. You think back to last Thursday, more than 30 killed in this city in those swarm air raids by the Russian military. Certainly this package, a fresh package of support through this new mechanism announced a few weeks ago by Donald Trump. Most of this equipment will be bought from the United States, coordinated by NATO, paid for by European countries. In this case, the Netherlands first out of the blocks, followed by Sweden, Denmark, Norway, clearly reaching more than $1 billion worth. They include, crucially for places like Kyiv, air defenses, as well as anti-tank weaponry, spare parts and more ammunition for Ukraine's armed forces. So there will be a sigh of relief, perhaps not in the next few days, because the deliveries of these weapons will take at least until the end of this month. But certainly that shift in the U.S. position will be a big sense of relief for those Ukrainians under Russian attack. Now, clearly, the air defenses over the last couple of months very seriously tested here and across Ukraine. So these deliveries, both in practice and for the safety of those Ukrainian cities and civilians, will be seen as a relief, but also that diplomatic shift from the United States. So certainly a small glimmer of hope for now here in Kyiv, Claudia.
Staying with that change in the White House for just a moment, Trump and Zelenskyy spoke in the last few hours. What did they agree on?
Well, there was a conversation between the two leaders, and it's certainly a world away from that bust-up in the Oval Office that we had seen a few months ago. There was talk of coordinating messages, updating the U.S. president on what is happening here on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, the president of Ukraine posting on X. Let's have a short clip of what he said in that post.
Today, we coordinated our positions, Ukraine and the United States. We exchanged assessments of the situation. The Russians have intensified the brutality of their attacks. President Trump is fully informed about Russian strikes on Kyiv and other cities and communities. Of course, we spoke about sanctions against Russia. Their economy continues to decline, and that's exactly why Moscow is so sensitive to this prospect and President Trump's resolve. This can change a lot.
So a coordination between the Ukrainian president and his American counterpart, certainly an improvement in those two men's relationship as well, possibly bringing hope as that 10 to 12 day deadline set by Donald Trump looms on Friday. There will be a lot of questions across this country about what exactly that means. We've seen Bloomberg reporting that Russia is considering perhaps giving some concessions to avoid those US sanctions, but at the moment we don't know. And that, of course, is the overarching theme. We've seen speculation in the last few hours, and it is just speculation on Ukrainian Telegram channels, that just tonight more Russian drones will be hitting this city. So while that deadline approaches, the risk remains very real here in Kyiv. Claudia.
Thank you so much for this update, Alex, and stay safe. This was Alex Cadier reporting live from Kyiv. Let's continue. Russian gasoline prices have reached their record high after Ukraine successfully struck multiple oil depots in the country. However, experts say the strikes were not the cause of the hike. Where does the price spike come from, and will it affect Russia's war effort funded by Moscow's crude sales? Kazimierz Łysiak looks for an answer to these questions in his latest report.
Strike after strike after strike. Multiple Russian oil depots have been hit by Ukrainian drones over the past week. Here, young Russian influencers are seen recording a video in front of one of the burning facilities. And since these successful hits are a source of embarrassment for the Russian authorities, the three TikTokers were quickly arrested, fined and forced to issue an apology. And while the price of gasoline has risen in Russia to a record high of about 830 euros per ton, the spike likely comes from something else.
The main factor for the prices on the world's oil market now is mainly connected with OPEC and with decisions of American administrations towards India and other states, other countries which are trading with Russia. Ukrainian attacks on Russian refineries strongly connected with the deadline of change of American policy towards Russia.
The deadline set by the US president runs out on August 8th or 9th. If Moscow doesn't agree to a ceasefire by then, the United States will impose secondary sanctions on countries purchasing Russian oil in bulk, like China and India.
India is not only buying massive amounts of Russian oil, they are then, for much of the oil purchase, selling it on the open market for big profits. They don't care how many people in Ukraine are being killed by the Russian war machine. Because of this, I will be substantially raising the tariff paid by India to the USA.
These secondary sanctions, or tariffs as Trump likes to call them, are expected to be a much harsher measure than anything imposed on Russia before. In 2024, Russia brought in a staggering $108 billion of revenue through energy sales.
It's crucial because Russian oil exports is the main source of money for any activity of the state. I would say Russia is exporting not only oil but also gas and natural resources.
India so far says it intends to keep purchasing Russian energy even if the US imposes high tariffs on Indian products. In the meantime, Ukraine and Russia keep targeting each other's energy infrastructure. For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Łysiak.
The European Commission has stood by its 15% tariff deal with the United States, reiterating the agreement was clinched with express support by a clear majority of the 27 EU member states. The remarks come as Germany's finance minister on Monday blasted the EU executive for employing what he described as weak negotiating tactics. More from our EU correspondent Angela Skujins in Brussels.
A day after Germany's finance minister Lars Klingbeil blasted Brussels over the European Commission's allegedly shonky tariff negotiating tactics, the EU executive has fired back. A spokesperson from the European Commission has stated that the EU executive was working with the express intent of the 27 EU member states, backing it up, which has resulted in that 15% tariff ceiling being slapped on most European goods imported into the US market as of Thursday this week. Let's take a listen to what the European Commission spokesperson had to say in regards to those comments coming out of Berlin.
It is most surprising to us to hear that a minister from the member state in question has expressed that view, given that nothing has happened here in terms of the Commission's approach, negotiation or outcome achieved without the clear signal received from our member states.
Before that, 15% tariff ceiling was mostly signed, sealed and delivered. The European Commissioner for Trade, Maroš Šefčovič, travelled between Brussels and Washington a total of 10 times to meet with his American counterparts to find the best deal for the 27 EU member states. We heard that he was working after speaking to stakeholders from those European countries, which signalled that they did not want an escalation in this trade war. They wanted stability. We're also hearing from our own sources in the Belgian capital that the 27 EU member states did not want a ratcheting up of tensions, as it could signal that the EU and the US were diverging on some key policies which could spiral out into more divergences and distractions, particularly shoring up support for Ukraine as that country weathers another year of Russian invasion. But in terms of the underpinnings and the trappings of this trade deal, we need that political agreement to be published. Our sources are telling us that this political document, which is no way binding, is 95% completed and is waiting for the sign-off from Washington before it can hit the ground running. Angela Skujins from Brussels for TVP World.
Israeli President Isaac Herzog's tour of the Baltic states continues in Latvia. Israel is facing mounting pressure and dissatisfaction over the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, while gradually becoming more and more isolated. Diana Skaya has more on what's been discussed and how Israel is trying to find its footing in Europe amid a growing perception crisis.
Israeli President Isaac Herzog is on a 3-day trip to Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, 3 Baltic countries. One big goal: prevent Israel's slide into total diplomatic isolation as major European states move closer to recognizing Palestine.
I can confirm the UK will recognize the state of Palestine.
On Tuesday, Latvian President Edgars Rinkēvičs reaffirmed his country's stance.
We believe that recognizing a Palestinian state at this moment would not truly facilitate a radical solution to the situation in a positive direction. Latvia currently does not plan to take such steps.
The Baltics offers something rare these days: a warmer welcome. It's a region where historic memory of Jewish culture and tragedy runs deep, and Herzog is using that connection to pass on a modern message. Gaza, hostages, October 7th still define the Israeli view of security.
Right now, the Palestinian people are torn between 2 entities. One is controlled by the Palestinian Authority and one is by Hamas. And if you ask an Israeli, an average Israeli, does he believe it's feasible to get to a 2-state solution, a solution with a peaceful neighbor, like I crossed the border today from Lithuania to Latvia easily? The answer will be no, because following October 7th, it was a wake-up call for many Israelis.
A day earlier, Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda stressed the urgent need to alleviate civilian suffering in Gaza.
Lithuania supports Israel's right to self-defense in accordance with the humanitarian law, but also reminds that the security of civilians and humanitarian staff, the inviolability of schools, hospitals and international organization sites are non-negotiable and mandatory.
And with Israel's trade agreement with the EU now also in question, Herzog's visit is part of a bigger strategy to build a network of allies who can temper the tone inside EU institutions.
We have 27 member states in the EU. Most of them have already recognized Palestine as a state. And are extremely critical and increasingly critical of Israelis' handling of the Gaza crisis. And Israel is just looking into potential allies here in Central Europe. They found a couple of those, for example, Hungary, for example, Czech Republic. They failed with Poland, and now they're looking into the Baltic states.
It may not be a diplomatic breakthrough, but on a continent where criticism is growing louder, even quiet friendships count. For TVP World, I'm Diana Skaya.
Serbia's President Aleksandar Vučić has pardoned a woman charged with ramming her vehicle into protesters in January earlier this year. And this wasn't the first time Vučić pardoned alleged assailants. Sonia Gatabišćan unpacks this recent development in her report on the situation in Serbia.
This driver that rammed into a student protester in January was pardoned by the Serbian president. Originally, she was accused of attempted murder, but her charges were later downgraded to a serious offense against public order. Ahead of the pardon, Aleksandar Vučić said, quote, "I now have to right the wrongs committed by prosecutors and courts.
I will continue to do so because the injustice is so obvious that I must protect the weak, the persecuted, and the victims of student demonstrators' daily attacks."
I find it very disturbing because it's a very clear statement that to his followers, I will take care of you regardless of what you do, legal or illegal. I think for anyone who believes in rule of law, this is a clear confirmation of his abuse of power.
This is not an isolated incident. Reportedly, there were 60 attacks against protesters up to the end of January 2025, half of which involved vehicle ramming.
The President of the Republic, in his TV statement after one of the first vehicle rammings, actually justified such behavior. And that was kind of an invitation for the series of following attacks and vehicle rammings.
This is also not Vucic's first pardon in recent months. In July, he pardoned 4 supporters of the ruling Serbian Progressive Party who were on trial for dislocating a student's jaw in January.
He is bending the law to suit his own needs, and that's why I think now, as the protest is progressing and becoming really a true threat for the future of his governance, he is making bolder and bolder steps and moving not from autocracy, which we have, but slowly moving into a dictatorial position.
Student-led protests, which have been ongoing since last November, follow a fatal railway station roof collapse in Novi Sad that killed 16 people. The protesters who call for accountability attribute the disaster to corruption. Among their most recent demands is a call for snap elections. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Gatabishchan.
Georgia's pro-Russian government is placing activists into psychiatric wards for observation, taking a step further in its pursuit to silence opposition voices. The highly controversial practice has already sparked a response from Georgians who are taking to the streets to thwart the government's abuse of power. Anastasia Yanchenko has more on the situation in Georgia.
The situation of political prisoners in Georgia is worsening. The ruling Georgian Dream Party has revived the practice of forcing activists into psychiatric treatment. The victim is an activist and teacher, Nino Datashvili, who was ordered by a Tbilisi court to undergo a 20-day psychiatric evaluation based on 2019 medical records citing emotional liability from a severe spinal condition. In a letter from prison, she strongly condemned the decision.
This emotional background is not permanent. It is the body's natural reaction to trauma and pain. And now, instead of offering treatment for my worsening condition, you order a psychiatric examination? This is nothing short of illegal persecution and inhumane treatment.
The case has sparked fears that this practice could become widespread. Protesters have gathered in central Tbilisi holding signs reading, "Don't use psychiatry for punishment."
There are lots of Russian-style laws in Georgia, lots of restrictions towards human rights, and I think this situation looks like an authoritarian regime.
Representatives of various professions, psychologists, lawyers, teachers, and social workers condemned the government's actions as abuse of psychiatry, with hundreds signing a petition.
In the Soviet Union, isolating dissidents by placing them in psychiatric institutions and treating them was a common method of political repression. Under international norms, such practice is classified as torture and inhumane treatment.
The controversy also drew comparisons to the Soviet-era case of journalist Nasi Shamanauri, who was forcibly sent to psychiatric treatment for her strong anti-governmental position.
And they locked her up in a psychiatric facility, and she was forced to take medication. She was physically tortured. Soviet prison, psychiatric facility, was a prison for political opponents, but it was way more horrific than an actual prison. And after 6 months or so, she died.
Protests in Georgia erupted in early 2024 over a controversial foreign agents law and escalated further when the ruling Georgian Dream Party suspended EU accession negotiations until 2028. Since then, local independent human rights organizations have reported about 460 politically motivated arrests, with dozens still detained and facing violent persecutions. The number continues to grow each month, now accompanied by the introduction of new violent measures against activists.
It is regarded as grounds for stigmatizing people. And basically what they're trying to say is, look, these people who are fighting against me, these people who are voicing their concerns against our injustice are actually crazy.
Nino Datashvili was arrested in late July after allegedly assaulting a court bailiff while supporting detained protesters. She faces 4 to 7 years in prison. This report for TVP World, Anastasia Yanchenko.
The trade deal struck between Donald Trump and Ursula von der Leyen was meant to bring an end to a several-month-long dispute. And yet, even though the agreement was fixed in practical terms, there are still many uncertainties when it comes to its implementation. To discuss the challenges the deal embodies, I'm joined by Ian Begg, Professorial Research Fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics. Good evening, sir, and thank you so much for joining me on the program.
Good evening to you too.
So the deal between the US and the EU was welcomed with a certain dose of relief for some, and yet there are many uncertainties. What are these uncertainties, and when is the deal going to be implemented?
Well, the first thing to say is that it's a political agreement between Trump and Ursula von der Leyen. As a political agreement, it has no formal legal standing, and what will be going on in both sides is an attempt to turn that political agreement into hard text, which sets the parameters and explains what's going to happen next. We also know that Trump in particular can be quite capricious, so that what he has agreed with Ursula von der Leyen during her visit to a Scottish golf course could easily be upset by some new decision on his part to use tariffs or other trade restrictions for entirely different purposes. So although the political deal is done, we're still a long way from having a formal, signed, legally binding document.
So how long do you think that could possibly take?
Months. Trade deals don't happen very easily because there's so much detail that has to go into them. So although the tone is set, it could be months, even into years, before the thing is formally settled.
So we've seen that European automotive industry suffered hundreds of millions of losses due to tariffs. They're about to lose billions of more, according to latest reports. There are still some moving parts. We know that the European automotive industry is also looking in the direction of, for example, Mexico and Canada, that has higher tariffs agreed when it comes to automotive parts. How do you think those losses in the automotive industry reflect on the overall state of the economy since this tariff discussion began?
Well, they clearly demonstrate the damage that's being done to particularly German exporters as a result of the tariffs that Trump has already imposed. It's also damaging from the perspective of uncertainty. You don't know whether the automobile industry will be fully brought within the proposed 15% tariff or will continue to have higher tariffs. There's also an uncertainty about whether parts, particularly parts coming from other parts of the world like China, will be subject to the same tariffs. They're built into European cars. Would they mean that the car is no longer eligible for the supposedly 15% favorable tariff? All these uncertainties are going to weigh on the industry, deter investment, and accentuate the losses they're already encountering.
I'm happy that you mentioned investments because according to the latest reports, one point of concern is actually investor confidence in the EU. That has fallen sharply after Donald Trump's trade agreement with Brussels. Is Europe going to bounce back from this worrisome trend, or are we going to see that it is going to thwart, in a way, the future of some foreign investments?
It's going to be a difficult few months because investors hate one thing above all, and that's uncertainty. If you're not certain what's going to happen, you're not certain what rules you're going to have to play with, and you're not certain what might come next by way of new restrictions or new terms, then you're going to hesitate to make that investment. That undermines the competitiveness of Europe as a whole and is going to be damaging to the economy. Now, Europe has a number of potential responses. It can look to other parts of the world to say, right, America's becoming much more difficult. Let's concentrate our exporting effort on elsewhere, which, let's face it, could well include China, which is something that causes its own political tensions.
As part of the EU deal, EUUS deal, Europe is set to invest $750 billion in energy purchases in general from the US by 2028. And yet the deal seems to be setting a sort of an unrealistic energy purchase target and is also making Europe dependent on majority of one source of energy, one provider. How do you think this issue is going to be addressed as the deal is enacted and is being discussed? As you said, it's going to take a few months since this is just a conversation that took place in Scotland.
Well, yes, as a Scot, I approve of conversations taking place in Scotland, as you must
We
understand.
very much do approve these conversations.
I think what we're seeing is a process in which things could change quite radically. And if things do start to change, then you will see an attempt by Europe to go outside and find different ways of dealing with this, as I already mentioned. But I think we should be rather careful not to speculate too much on things like the energy market, because let's face it, energy is bought by private sector actors, not by governments. Governments cannot impose a deal on how much energy the Polish energy industry, the German energy industry, or any other energy industry is prepared to buy. It's a long-term objective. Now, whether tying yourself to US producers of liquefied natural gas or any other energy source that the Americans might want to export is a good or a bad idea depends on your underlying thoughts about whether energy prices from other sources will go up or down. I think it's unrealistic to expect that scale of energy import from the US to happen. But let's face it, by 2028, Trump really ought to be on his way out.
And how well do you think EU is doing in terms of balancing energy security and political realities as of now?
Well, Europe's been through a difficult time because of the dependence of so many countries, Poland being the exception, on gas coming from Russia. It was a big factor for Germany. Germany's had to adjust very rapidly to a new regime. Other countries like Slovakia and Hungary are still highly dependent on Russian gas, as is Austria. So it's something that is a weaning away from the easy source, the cheap source that used to be Russia. Now, whether the settlement, assuming it happens within a relatively short time frame of the Ukraine war, means that Russia comes back into being acceptable as a source of imports of energy, that could change things. But there's also the strong move towards renewable energy, which Germany is accelerating as a way of insulating itself and providing its own energy security. So there's many things going on in the energy market simultaneously. And I don't think that this huge figure of planned imports from the US will in fact happen.
So there seems to be a clear widening gap when it comes to EU officials. We've heard from François Bayrou of France, who said he's actually leading in the course when it comes to the criticism. And he said, I quote, "It is a dark day when an alliance of free peoples united to assert their values and defend their interests resigns itself to submission." And he posted that on his X platform. He was referring to Donald Trump and Europe's submission to him. On the other hand, we have Chancellor Merz and Giorgia Meloni welcoming the deal. So what does this tell us about the unity of decision-making in Europe?
Well, you refer to them as EU officials. They are not EU officials. They're national politicians. And national politicians tend to play to their national galleries.
So what game are they playing?
François Bayrou in France is in a very delicate position. He's going to struggle to put through his current budget through the French Assemblée Nationale. So he is want to be seen to be tough, to stand up for France in a way which will endear him to some of the supporters he needs to attract to survive in France. Someone like Merz, I think, is being more realistic. He's saying, right, it's not a great deal, but it could have been a lot worse. And if it could have been a lot worse, then we really ought to accept it, because it means that we're not going into something that would be far more damaging for us. It would seem that Giorgia Meloni is saying the same thing. So you need to break down the motivations of those who are criticizing the current deal to ask what do they hope to get out of it. In nearly all cases, it's trying to speak to a domestic audience far more than to any other audience.
Just before we go, how do you think this threat of higher tariffs on India by the US is going to affect peace on the European continent? There is definitely a connection there, especially when it comes to the deals that India has with Russia.
Yes, well, this is what's known in the trade as secondary tariffs. The idea is that the US will penalize any country which doesn't do what it wants for political reasons. In India's case, it's because India is continuing to be a major importer of Russian oil and therefore funding the war in Ukraine. The Americans are now turning against the Russians in that respect, and they seem to be saying if India continues on this path, then India will be hit as a way of hitting Russia. Now, whether that can be realized is a different story, because India is a big economy. It's not a country that you can play with and just say, right, you're like a small country. Let's take Switzerland, who we can impose tariffs on and nobody else will care very much. India matters in the global economy. So I think that it's a dangerous game that Trump's playing, and it's by no means obvious that he will succeed in imposing these secondary tariffs in the way he's announced. But we have the countdown of just a few days until his 10 to 12 days for Russia to change its stance. So I think we'll have to come back to this in beginning of next week.
Definitely. There are some very interesting developments ahead of us. Ian Begg, Professorial Research Fellow at the European Institute of the London School of Economics. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
And so this would be all for now here on World News Tonight. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska. Thank you so much for joining me. But I do hope you're going to stay here on TVP World for more news and features in just a moment.